Hi, this is Adam Blaylock, and you're listening to Adam the Movie Guy. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy the show. Warning, the show you're about to listen to contains strong language and an unhinged host. Don't take me too serious, I'm doing a bit here, so stay the fuck off my back. Enjoy. If this shocks you, if this offends you, and you clicked on the wrong fucking podcast. Welcome everyone. Today's show is Friday the 13th, Part 2. The Body Count Continues. Directed by Steve Miner and written by Victor Miller and Ron Kurtz, once again returning from the last film to pen this one, starring Steve Dash and Warrington Gillette for one scene as Jason. I'll get into that later, trust me. Adrienne King as a returning Alice. Don't get too used to seeing her back. Trust me on that one too. Amy Steele as Ginny. John Furry as Paul. Kirsten Baker as Terry. Stu Charno as Ted. Marta Koba as Sandra. Tom McBride as Mark. Bill Randolph as Jeff, Lori Marie Taylor as Vicky, Russell Todd as Scott, Jack Marks as Officer Winslow, and both the returning Walt Gorney as Crazy Ralph, and the Queen herself, Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees in a quick appearance. The format is going to be the same as the last episode, running through the plot, going into the characters, movie trivia background knowledge, and my own personal takes on the movie, followed by, once again, the hottest girl and hottest guy, and final overall thoughts and rating of the movie. So, let's get on to it, starting with the plot. Alright, so the movie kicks off with returning final girl Alice from the last movie having a nightmare that recaps the final act of the previous film. She lives alone and apparently close enough to Crystal Lake that Jason can easily track her down. Yeah, you heard that right. Jason, the dead kid of the last movie's villain, Mrs. Voorhees, is actually alive somehow and now a grown-ass man. Trust me, I'm going to address this a lot more in detail in an upcoming segment. Anyway, he sneaks into Alice's place, puts his mother's decapitated head in her fridge to scare the living piss out of her, before taking his revenge by shoving an ice pick through her temple. I gotta say, that took a lot of thought to do for Jason, who often is stereotyped as being pretty stupid. Anyway, cue the opening title of Friday the 13th exploding and turning into, you guessed it, a part 2. And here we go. We get a time skip of 5 years, and things have been quiet at Crystal Lake until now, when a counselor training camp called Packanack sets up shop headed by the character Paul. His assistant Jenny, our final girl for this one, is one for the books, I tell you. I'll go into her more in detail in the character segment. As far as counselors in training go, there's Jeff and Sandra, our main frisky couple, Scott, our immature pretty boy, Terry, who exudes sex out of her pores, Ted, the classic prankster, Mark, a former star athlete. Now he's Franklin from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Well, that's not really accurate. Aside from being in a wheelchair, Mark is the hot guy Franklin wishes he could be. Also, unlike Franklin, Mark is not the most annoying motherfucker in the goddamn movie. And finally, there's Vicky, the sweet girl with the huge crush on Mark, who you could see like 10 miles away. There's a handful of other unnamed counselors the movie doesn't give a fuck about, and quite frankly, neither do I. They don't even get names. Oh, and there's this cute white dog that belongs to Terry called Muffin, which, damn, that's a perfect name for a dog. Anyway, back to the plot. The counselors are being whipped into shape and eventually take some time off to enjoy the lake, similar to the previous movie's lake scene. So horny couple Jeff and Sandra sneak away to check out the old Camp Crystal Lake grounds, which have been closed off and forbidden to the public ever since the massacre from 5 years ago. Upon coming across the grounds, they find a suspiciously looking dog corpse that, I'll be damned, I'm pretty sure is Muffin to this day. But anyway, they're caught by Officer Winslow, who was tailing them, and he hauls them back to Packanack Lodge. After we get a scene of Winslow reading Paul the riot act about keeping his people away from the camp, he's driving in the woods when he spots Sackhead Jason running across the road like something out of a Bigfoot movie. He chases Jason out on foot for a good while before coming across a shack in the woods that happens to be the house of Jason. Damn, that actually would be a great movie title. House of Jason. Anyway, he's quickly killed with a claw hammer to the back of his head, similar to the security guard from Halloween 2, and I'm pretty sure they ripped this movie off. I mean, the timing was pretty damn spot on. I mean, this came out like, what, a couple months before Halloween 2? Anyway, cut to a later night at Packanack, and a majority of the counselors, headed by Paul, Ginny, and Ted, drive out to the town bar to get fucked up and leaving the rest behind to get slaughtered. At the bar, Ginny is getting all psychological about Jason's mindset, while it's just being laughed off by Ted and Paul as being an urban legend. More on Ginny's psychological knowledge later on. It'll come very, very importantly into play. Back at camp, everyone is pairing off, starting with Terry going skinny dipping. Whew, damn. And Scott being a dickhead and stealing her clothes like a loser who doesn't know how to fucking talk to women. He ends up getting caught in a snare and strung up upside down like he's the catch of the day, while Terry runs to get a knife to cut his ass down. Gotta say, Terry's a lot nicer than I would have been. I would have just left his ass up there all the way until fucking morning. Anyway, Scott ends up getting his throat slashed by Jason, and Terry is killed off screen after she discovers his body, which is, honestly, I kind of wish we would have saw how she, got. I have no idea how Jason killed her. I gotta read the novelization to probably find out. Anyway, back inside, Sandra and Jeff go upstairs to have sex. Meanwhile, Vicky finally makes her move on Mark after being pretty obvious about her feelings for him. She finally makes a move. Anyway, they briefly separate so Vicky can change into the most hideous fucking pair of panties I have ever seen in my life. So Jason takes advantage of this situation by killing Mark via machete to the face and pushing his Meals on Wheels ass down a flight of steps. It is fucking hysterical. You seriously gotta watch that movie just for that scene alone. Anyway, Jason then heads upstairs to kill Jeff and Sandra by taking a spear that Ted, the class clown over there, was fucking around with earlier during a campfire scene to scare the shit out of everybody. Jason takes the spear and impales the both of them right after they just finish screwing their heads off, which I'm kind of pissed off that they cut all the freaking kills for this movie down to almost nothing. I'll probably go on a rant about that later. Although, Jason's pretty considerate of letting them finish before he kills them, so points to Jason for being pretty considerate. Anyway, Vicky finally shows back up to go upstairs to see where the hell Mark went at, and Jason scares the living shit out of her by hiding underneath some pillow sheets. No, not fucking pillow sheets. Bed sheets. Jesus, this is what happens when I record after drinking rum. Anyway, Jason scares the living shit out of her, and then he just plunges a knife right into her gut, offing her. So, meanwhile, Ginny and Paul finally return from the bar, and they leave Ted behind because he was shooting his shot with the cute bartender he was making eyes with earlier on. They discover the mess left behind before being attacked by Jason, who knocks Paul right the fuck out. Gee, good job, Paul. Thanks for being useful. And Jason proceeds to chase Ginny all over the camp, with a pretty nice cat and mouse game going on between them. And Jason's a clumsy motherfucker in this movie, I'll tell you that much. Ginny eventually makes her way inside to Jason's shitbox of a house that we saw earlier with him killing off Officer Winslow, and she discovers a shrine to Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's dead mom, with her severed head on this little pedestal shrine and her old crusty-ass sweater surrounded by candles. That's definitely not a fire hazard. Anyway, Ginny gets the genius-level idea of putting Jason's mother's sweater on and to confuse the big motherfucker because apparently Jason has the IQ of a raisin and that actually manages to work, which is kind of funny. Anyway, Ginny tries to take him out while he's distracted, but he eventually realizes that this is whole situation is bullshit. And he takes a swing at her from a pickaxe before Paul finally gets his ass up and makes himself useful by distracting Jason. He gets his ass kicked, but at least he gives Ginny enough time to grab a machete that was left over, and she impales Jason's shoulder, which, okay, I'm going to talk a lot about that later on, of how that's fucking bullshit, how he survived that. But anyway, I keep going off on these tangents. Seriously, never drinking podcasts. I'm not recording this shit again. So Ginny unmasks Jason, and they're both disgusted with his appearance, which is hidden off screen. So Ginny and Paul limp their beaten up asses back to Packanack Cabins to recuperate, and Muffin, who was thought to be dead, shows up, and just when everything looks alright, Jason bursts through the window right behind Ginny, grabbing her, and we get a full reveal of his fucked up face. And it is just disgusting. I mean, the last time Jason grabbed someone by surprise, once again, it turns out to be a dream, just like Alice had in the last movie. And Ginny wakes up on a gurney, being put in an ambulance, asking for the whereabouts of Paul, who, personally, I'm convinced Jason tore to freaking shreds. The film ends with a close-up of Mrs. Voorhees' decapitated head. Wow, there's a lot to unpack with this movie. I'm going to start with the characters for the next segment. I need to stop drinking. Alright, the first character I'm going to cover is Bill Randolph's Jeff. Honestly, there's not really much to talk about in regards to Jeff, other than the fact that he gets to fuck Sandra. And he doesn't have the balls to tell Terry her dog was murdered. He doesn't really do a damn thing in regards to the overall plot, and he's pretty forgettable. Next up is Marta Koba's Sandra. She's in the same boat as Jeff in regards to doing fuck all to the plot, aside from possibly discovering Muffin's corpse, ? It's kind of ambiguous. She's only more interesting on the grounds that she's easier on the eyes than Jeff and really fills out a bikini top. Oh, and for some dumbass reason, she's that curious to see the old Crystal Lake campgrounds just to say she was there to a bunch of assholes back in the city. Next is Kirsten Baker's Terry. Jean shorts and skinny dipping. Need I say more? I'll give it a try. Is she important to the plot? No. Do I give a fuck about that? Also no. All I can say about her in regards to the overall movie is that her scenes leave quite the impression for obvious reasons. Although, after watching the movie, my only two nitpicks I have with her are, why would you bring your dog to what is technically job training, and why is she so patient when it comes to Scott's bullshit? And I refuse to believe she had serious interest in that idiot other than mild amusement. Also, she's really rocking that Mickey Mouse shirt. I'm sure Disney himself would approve. Next, we got Russell Todd Scott. Honestly, this guy fucking sucks. What I don't get is he's a handsome son of a bitch who probably could pull Terry if he talked to her, and yet he chooses to act like a child. I mean, for Christ's sake, this guy literally has a slingshot like he's a shitty Dennis the Menace ripoff, and he shoots Terry with it. Aside from the admittingly great shot of her ass we got, he's an asshole. And he steals her clothes while she's skinny dipping because he's just that guy. In conclusion, he could go drown in the lake like Jason for all I care. Next is Tom McBride's Mark. This guy to me was probably the nicest character in the film. And he also makes me ashamed of myself because this guy in a wheelchair has more game than I ever will in my life because he got Vicky without even trying. He also has the best kill in the movie with Jason pretty much performing a double tap with the machete to the face and pushes his ass down that really long flight of stairs. Alright, next up we got Laurie Marie Taylor's Vicky. The whole thing with Vicky is the fact that she's horny for Mark. I mean, she pretty much saw him roll up to camp and said, "He's mine." She's very cute, and the vibe I get from her is she's the classic goody-goody girl going slightly bad for the first time. Well, slightly bad as in air finger quotes bad. I mean, it's especially noticeable when she tries to light a joint. There's no fucking way in the world she even knows what a joint is. The biggest thing I notice about her is she has god-awful taste in underwear. Now let me explain. In the movie, when she goes to freshen up for Mark before they're supposed to hook up with each other, she switches her black pair of underwear to this frumpy, brownish, tan, granny panties, and every time I watch this movie, I say to myself, come on, Vicky, that's the best you got? You were better off with the black pair. Then again, being a guy and putting myself in Mark's position, she could have wore a hefty trash bag. For all I care, it's all going to come off anyway. So, there's that. Next up, we got Stuart Charno as Ted. Ted, to me, always came across as the most unexplored character in the movie. I know he was essentially the laid-back prankster, but I couldn't help but think they could have gave him more to do, since he seems to be Paul's right-hand man while Ginny is the left. The most interesting thing they do with his character is the fact that they don't kill him off, and it's implied he actually might have hooked up with that bartender he was making eyes at earlier in the movie. Usually the prankster dies in slasher films, but Ted stands out not only as a more realistic example of the archetype, but a damn lucky one too. Next is Jack Mark's Officer Winslow. I mean, for the short amount of screen time this guy gets, he definitely serves his purpose as a realistic cop who just wants to do his job and make sure these dumbass kids don't get into trouble. His scene chasing down Jason is unique in the series since everybody else runs their ass away from him, while this guy just sees a 6'4" man with a sack over his head and says, yeah, I want that smoke. He's probably one of the more ballsy characters in the series in a funny sort of way. Last thing about him is, seriously, what was he going to do if he actually caught up to Jason other than die horribly, which is exactly what happens anyway. I mean, he didn't have a gun from what I saw of him in the film, so again, I repeat, what was he going to do? Anyway, next up, let's talk about John Foray as Paul. Paul is the pretty chill and level-headed boss of the whole operation at Packanack, and out of all the characters, he comes across to me as someone who wants to do something good for a community while also being down to earth and relatable. This movie could have made him a complete tool, which I'm glad it didn't. I mean, he could have just been the stereotypical asshole boss that everybody hates and can't stand, but I'm glad they made him realistic and, you know, pretty easy and relatable to deal with as a person. His relationship with Ginny is pretty believable, and they honestly are the best couple in the movie, in my opinion, and I actually feel they would last a long time, unlike Jeff and Sandra, who, let's be honest, would only last a few years tops anyway. The last thing I want to address about his character is his ultimate fate. I know for years the Friday the 13th fandom debated on what happened to him, and guys, I hate to break it to you, but he's worm food. Both Steve Miner and Ron Kurtz, the director and writer of the movie respectively, said that so themselves. I mean, besides, Jenny was stated to be the lone survivor, so the whole they never found his body thing was bullshit. So, guys, he's dead. Move on. Next up, our final girl, Ginny. Ginny is hands down one of the best final girls of the entire series. She's very likable, relatable, smart, strong, and actually wants to try to understand Jason. It's stated in the movie she was going to school to become a child psychologist, and it shows perfectly in the scene at the bar with Ginny pondering about the mindset of Jason and why he is the way that he is. And she's more willing to believe that he's alive and not just some urban legend. And the other scene being her putting on Mrs. Voorhees' sweater to confuse Jason as a distraction, since for all his cunning when it comes to killing, Jason deep down is just that scared, picked-on kid whose mother was his entire world. I personally would have loved to see if she became the Dr. Loomis of the series for a couple more installments. Hell, she could have met up with future character Tommy Jarvis and swapped some notes, but I'll get to him once I finally cover part 4. And now, we talk about the legend himself, Jason Voorhees. This is hands down one of the most underrated takes on Jason in the whole series. This is the most human and realistic we ever see Jason, where he's not this unstoppable undead guy, and he's just this tall, relentless son of a bitch. He shows a surprising amount of intelligence, managing to somehow track down Alice to wherever the hell she was living, and being mindful to take the kettle off the stove, which is kind of funny. And honestly, guys, and I know I may get shit for this, but personally, I prefer the sackhead look over the hockey mask. Now, I get it. the hockey mask is just so damn iconic, but something about Jason wearing a sack over his head not only is more realistic, but much more intimidating. The reboot that came out in 2009, in my opinion, took the sack head look and perfected it, but I'll get to that in the future. Last characters I wanted to talk about just for a brief sec were Crazy Ralph and Mrs. Voorhees, both returning for brief appearances. Crazy Ralph appears in about 2 scenes. The first consisting of him warning Jeff and Sandra that they're going to meet the same fate as the characters from the previous film. And the next is him being killed off by Jason strangling him with some barbed wire from behind a tree. Oddly enough, he may have been something of a peeping Tom since he was watching Ginny and Paul during an intimate moment outside their cabin when Jason killed him. I kind of wish he lived and made repeating appearances through each installment of the series. It would have been a nice recurring element. And last but not certainly least, Mrs. Voorhees makes a tiny appearance toward the end when the scene when Jenny puts on her sweater to confuse Jason. Jason in his mind was seeing and hearing his mother, which was very effective to get a tiny glimpse into his mind, and even manages to wring out a surprising amount of sympathy. Now that I think about it, it would have been nice in another good recurring element in the series where every now and then we see Mrs. Voorhees in the background when Jason's on screen as if she's encouraging his homicidal tendencies. Or we hear her voice in a ghostly whisper, something along those lines. Basically what the Friday the 13th game did when playing as Jason and you killed another player. Or how the remake of Halloween 2 did, just not fucking terrible and stupid. That about covers all the major characters. Let's move on to the next segment. Alright, let's get into some trivia in the form of Did You Know? Followed by me ranting about the biggest elephant in the room in regards to this movie and the series as a whole. For the first, did you know that the director, Sean Cunningham, originally toyed with the idea of the movies being an annually released anthology-style series with their own original stories with the only recurring theme of taking place on or around the Friday the 13th holiday? When the decision was made to have Jason become the new killer, he thought it was stupid since to him, Jason was just a dead kid who was the motive of the massacre for the first film, and it just didn't make sense. So he passed on directing part 2. Next, did you know that the MPAA ratings board censored the living hell out of this movie, severely cutting down the kills to damn near nothing in some cases? For example, Scott's kill was much more gruesome when his throat is slit, and if you watch the uncut footage, you see blood just pouring down his face, going into his eyes and nose, and it's pretty gruesome. Or when Alice gets killed in the opening with the ice pick to the temple, in the uncut footage, it goes through her temple, out of the bridge of her nose. Or when Jeff and Sandra got impaled by the spear, it was much more longer in the uncut footage, and you see Sandra attempt to push Jeff off of her. Next, did you know that for years it was believed there was a much more graphic sex scene between Jeff and Sandra that got cut, but recently it's been debunked in the Sackhead book, which discusses the makings of Friday the 13th Part 2. Did you know that famous special effects man Tom Savini, who did all the gore effects for the kills in the original movie, declined to do Part 2, and instead took up a job offer to a competing summer camp slasher movie called The Burning, which released the same year? And last, did you know that Betsy Palmer only agreed to come back for those scenes of Mrs. Voorhees if it wouldn't be an inconvenience to her? They actually filmed her scenes in her home in the garage. And that's all for the trivia section. Now let's get on to the ranting and go over the biggest elephant in the room I mentioned earlier. How is Jason alive? In the original movie, he's treated as being long dead, and that was the whole crux of Mrs. Voorhees going off the deep end. Now this movie comes around and says he never drowned, and was just hiding somewhere in the woods for years, living off game or whatever he can get his hands on. Now the whole entire thing with the Friday the 13th series is that in parts 2 to 4, which featured Jason as the killer, aside from being ridiculously strong and durable, he's pretty human. Then we get to part 6, where he's literally resurrected from the grave by a bolt of lightning like the Frankenstein monster, and he became the undead supernatural killer everyone pictures in their head whenever he's brought up. My personal take on this is splitting the difference and saying there was always a supernatural element to Jason that just went from being somewhat subtle from part 1 to 4, and it just became explicit come part 6 and onwards. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't mention part 5, there's a big reason for that, but I'll get to that when I cover it. Speaking of which, when I get to part 9, I'll further elaborate on this interpretation of Jason always being supernatural. Yeah, I know, the dreaded part 9. Bear with me on that one when I get to it. And that's all for trivia in the rant section. Let's move on to the next segment. Now, let's get into the best characters of the movie, followed by the hottest girl and hottest guy. This is hands down the easiest section of the movie because Ginny steals the entire show. This is her movie. I mean, she works as such a perfect foil to Jason, and the whole time I was watching her, I kept saying to myself it's criminal that they never got her to come back as a recurring enemy to Jason, like they did with future character Tommy Jarvis, who's introduced in part 4. She's everything you would want in a final girl / nemesis. She's intelligent, she's kind, she's strong, she's beautiful, and played by a pretty good actress. She's the biggest what could have been if they brought her in for at least 2 or 3 more installments of the series, and I personally would have loved to see her. Next up, we got the hottest girl and guy. The hottest girl belongs to Terry without question. Even without her skinny dipping scene, she won this category in the first 10 seconds of her screen time in that Mickey Mouse shirt and her jean shorts. Just wow. As for the guy, that unfortunately belongs to, Scott, who I still can't stand as a character. I mean, I'll give him credit for being admittingly a handsome son of a bitch, but too bad his personality doesn't match his looks. In conclusion, fuck Scott. Alright, let's move on to the next part. Now we're at the finish line for the episode, everybody, as I give my film ranking and final thoughts of the movie. I'm going to award this film 4 decapitated heads out of 5. It's held up as one of the best in the series for a good reason. Similar to the first film, it's unique to the rest of the series since Jason is not yet what people associate with the Friday the 13th franchise. And I mean that in the best possible way, since I actually prefer the Jason of the early movies, aka Living Jason, from parts 2 to 4. This is a Jason I could actually imagine existing, and in my opinion, scarier in that aspect. Final comment on that, Sackhead Jason looks scarier than Hockey Mask Jason. That is a fact, not opinion. Well, everyone, that concludes episode 2 of my Friday the 13th series retrospective. I hope you enjoyed it and had a few laughs along the way. Stay tuned for episode 3, where I will be covering Friday the 13th part 3 in 3D. It may come late since I'll be celebrating my 28th birthday this weekend as of this episode date. Thank you so much for listening to my ramblings and being patient as I go on to become a better podcaster and find my voice. Baby steps, people. Baby steps. Thank you and good night. River of joy.